African American boys in Compton are born into gangs and never get equal opportunities. Most, if not all of them, have never seen the Pacific, which is not even 15 miles from the town. The young men are not even granted the opportunity to work jobs or become a middle-class individual. These African Americans in Compton have never learned anything other than gangs and fights because no one believes in them to do better. An example is Travon Brown Jr., a 20-year-old black man who died Sunday, December 3rd after he was shot in the 200 block of Willbrook Avenue in Compton. Brown was standing near the ticket machine on the Metro Blue Line passenger platform about 3:30 p.m. when he began arguing with a group of people who got from the train. Words were thrown back and forth, and it was a gang-related thing. Somehow, someone got disrespected and it became a fight. Then a gunshot was fired and the victim was struck. Most, if not all, of these men go to jail, and after they do so, they do not get jobs and return back to their life in gangs.
Although many are subject to the impression that bondage in such a broken democracy that oppressed African Americans is something of the past, it is still present in the new form of mass incarceration. Traces of past racism is ever present within the criminal justice system, a flawed system that continuously incarcerates a disproportionate number of African Americans. Racial profiling and racial bias has contributed to the development of this system that perpetually forces African Americans to adopt a subordinate lifestyle, similar to the effects of previous institutions such as Jim Crow. However, mass incarceration is greatly overlooked and under-acknowledged. African Americans are repeatedly targeted and suspected of drug crimes and criminal acts due to their race. Despite the fact that African Americans only represent a small portion of our nation's population, they account for 43% of those imprisoned, many imprisoned for small and menial crimes. They are also 6 times more likely to go to jail than a white person. 1 in 3 African Americans will go to prison throughout their lifetime, and 10% of African American children attending school will have an incarcerated parent. This affects the children's mental health as well as their families because they struggle to make a sufficient living with one parent in jail. And in turn, this affects the next generations of African Americans, oppressing them within society and impairing them from breaking out of this cycle, continually forcing them down into a worse existence. Many African Americans are also imprisoned for menial crimes that were established aimed to imprison African Americans in the first place. 90% of the people convicted for drug crimes are African Americans, and they are mostly convicted for small possessions of marijuana. And the racism behind African American imprisonment for drug crimes dates back to the war on drugs. And in 1970, President Nixon ordered a war on drugs designed to arrest African Americans who were associated with drugs like marijuana and cocaine at the time. Marijuana became a bad offense that locked up many African Americans, and the government targeted small, poor neighborhoods and minority neighborhoods. And however, when eventually marijuana became associated with white college students and white wealthy people, they tested the drug with an administration which ruled it to be less harmful, and they dissociated it with drugs like cocaine and heroin, therefore reducing the sentence. So it is aimed to imprison African Americans and was made worse in order to lock them up. And today, many African Americans still go to prison for drug crimes, and this war on drugs has inflicted unequal outcomes and punishments to their communities of color, which continues to lock them up in prison and then deprive them of opportunities when they are released from jail. In comparison to the 350,000 African Americans that were incarcerated before 1970, which is before the drug war, there are over 2 million African Americans present in our prisons today. Not only does mass incarceration lock up a large amount of African Americans in prison, but it also impairs their opportunities once they're released from prison, forcing them into a subordinate existence. When released from prison, African Americans struggle to find employment due to having a federal offense, and they don't have the right to vote while on parole. As a result, they are more likely to enter a life of poverty and further discrimination. Therefore, an achievement gap is established between African Americans and privileged whites, where whites continue to make money and live in nice neighborhoods, while African Americans find it very hard to get out of their poverty. African Americans face unequal opportunities in the workforce as a result of their incarceration. They have more than an 8.8% unemployment rate, which is more than twice the percentage of whites. Background checks are performed to screen applicants of jobs, and employers claim that they would not hire an applicant that has a criminal record, and their inability to find work further leads African Americans into poverty. 27.4% of African Americans live in poverty, in comparison to 9.9% of whites, and 45.8% of young black children live in poverty. Mass incarceration is structured to target those of inner city neighborhoods and poor minority neighborhoods, established in such a way that prohibits the rise of African Americans in society and equality under the government. It is an issue that mimics past institutions of racial discrimination, but is greatly ignored as there is no direct laws discriminating the African Americans. However, through laws impairing rights of prisoners, it is a loophole and a way to continue the subordination of African Americans. What do we do to address this issue? We need to bring attention to mass incarceration and allow people to see it as a form of racial discrimination, because it targets African Americans, and then once they're released, they are introduced to many laws, regulations, and restrictions that govern ex-criminals. Therefore, we need to be able to reduce the amount of people that are incarcerated, and also to not have so many restrictions once they're released to prevent them from flourishing within society. The NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, has various organizations that help African Americans that were incarcerated. The Ban the Box organization is a national civil rights campaign that assists formerly incarcerated people become reintegrated into society after the release. And the founders acknowledged that jobs and housing discrimination towards people exist, and as a result, the organization supports the removal of a conviction history on applications so that African Americans do not face discrimination when applying for jobs and have trouble finding employment. In addition, they created a Ban the Box anti-discriminatory policy towards housing, and this will prevent those who are formerly incarcerated, a majority of them African American, from being excluded from certain neighborhoods due to their conviction, and this will give them more opportunity and possibly a better education to enhance their position within society. Another organization is Protect and Preserve Our Lives Pledge, and this addresses the issue of police brutality and racial discrimination when putting African Americans into prisons. And some of the laws state that a cut of federal spending to law enforcement agencies that undertake a pattern or practice of racial discrimination, and there'll be a federal code of conduct to provide local law enforcement agencies a minimum standard on the use of force, and to establish a federal independent review board to investigate police shootings of unarmed individuals, which is a big problem with African Americans. And not having to fill out your criminal record history on an application will help African Americans not face discrimination with employment, and they won't have to struggle to gain money and a job. So this will help lead them out of poverty and out of their poor neighborhoods, because they also won't be discriminated against for housing. And along with that, less African Americans will be incarcerated and sent to prison, because the police will be making sure that they do not lock up African Americans for racist reasons, and the government will be overviewing that. So racist patterns will reduce, and the number of African Americans in prison will also.
Mass incarceration is a huge issue in today's society. Many children are losing their parents to this issue and growing up with one or no loved one. These kids then learn nothing other than crime and go down the same paths as their parents. Later, when they get out of prison, they have no job and cannot support their family, resulting in the kids losing their parents again. If we had these organizations, these problems would no longer be with us. Parents would have jobs and their kids. With the help of your advocacy, African Americans will not face the same discrimination. They will not be continually forced into a second-class society, and the high rates of African Americans in prison will greatly reduce. It's time to accept that racism is a very big issue today and we need to take action.